What was S3X really like in ancient Egypt? And more, hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a world of linen, incense, and far too much sand. A world where gods walked in animal heads, where kings were worshipped like sun-born divinities, and where even the most mundane human activities, eating, washing, marrying, and yes, mating, were observed under the watchful eye of the divine. So, settle in. Dim the lights, let your phone rest on the pillow beside you, and get comfortable. Because tonight, we're going to wander through the strange, slightly awkward, and surprisingly human history of intimacy in ancient Egypt, along with a few other royal oddities that spin out from it. Don't worry. This won't be a scandalized modern exposé or a breathless soap opera. Think of it more as a quiet stroll through dusty papyri, faded wall paintings, and the very peculiar personal habits of the pharaohs. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that powerful people rarely manage to behave like sensible ones. Now, when it comes to ancient Egypt, the first thing to remember is people were still people. Despite the pyramids, the mummies, and the divine titles, they had the same awkward, complicated desires as anyone else. The difference is that their entire worldview wrapped even the simplest things, like marriage or childbirth, in heavy layers of cosmic symbolism. For example, to the Egyptians, sexuality wasn't simply physical, it was divine. Creation itself, they believed, had sprung from a sort of cosmic act of self-love performed by the first god, Atom. He, rather proudly, produced the first generation of gods from his own body, a myth that, I imagine, must have been rather uncomfortable to explain to children. And from there, nearly every royal act of intimacy was loaded with cosmic meaning. The Nile flooding each year wasn't just a nice bit of irrigation. It was the land itself being fertilized, which meant, naturally, that the king and queen had to mirror these cycles in their own rituals. Symbolism piled upon symbolism, until the royal bedchamber was essentially a theological battlefield. Let's drift to one of the more awkward traditions, fertility festivals. There's evidence that during certain ceremonies, the pharaoh was expected to publicly display his virility, sometimes even in ways that sound like they belonged in a far less family-friendly genre of performance. The reasoning was simple. If the pharaoh was potent, the land would be too. The crops depended, in a way, on his stamina. Imagine your entire country judging the year's harvest by your personal abilities. No pressure at all. The everyday Egyptians, of course, lived with less ceremonial weight. Marriage was a straightforward affair. There were no lavish legal ceremonies, no priests, no temples required. If a man and woman moved in together, shared a home, and called each other husband and wife, that was enough. A practical arrangement? Romantic, perhaps not, but functional divorce was also simple. If things didn't work out, either partner could walk away. Women, remarkably, had more legal independence in Egypt than in many later civilizations. They could own property, sue in court, and leave unhappy marriages. Not exactly a feminist paradise, but certainly a more flexible society than, say, medieval Europe, where a woman was essentially the property of whichever grumpy man happened to claim her. Now, you might be wondering what intimacy itself was like. Here the historical record becomes creative. The Egyptians, like the Greeks and Romans after them, had their share of risque graffiti. Some of the surviving fragments are, frankly, what we'd call not safe for work. except they were carved onto public walls, so technically safe for everyone's morning commute. One particularly famous papyrus, known as the Turin erotic papyrus, is filled with illustrations that leave little to the imagination. Scholars have debated whether it was meant as satire, as bawdy entertainment, or perhaps even instructional material. Personally, I like to think it was just someone's ancient sketchbook that wasn't meant to survive 3,000 years, because that is exactly the kind of bad luck history has. Pharaohs, of course, treated intimacy less like a private matter and more like a dynastic chess move. The royal household was a maze of siblings, half-siblings, cousins, and political wives, all strategically arranged to maintain the purity of the bloodline, which in practice usually meant the bloodline was getting progressively thinner, weaker, and more accident-prone. Take Ptolemy II, for instance. He married his full sister Arsinoe. The Greeks, who had their own share of odd habits, were still somewhat scandalized by this. But in Egypt, the royal family was supposed to mirror the gods, many of whom had no qualms about sibling marriages. By keeping it in the family, pharaohs claimed to maintain their divine essence. What they actually maintained was a long tradition of genetic headaches. And then, of course, there's Cleopatra VII, famous for her beauty, though in truth, most coins suggest she looked more like someone permanently suspicious of everyone around her. Cleopatra had relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, both legendary in their own right, though neither partnership ended particularly well. One was assassinated, the other died in a disastrous war, and Cleopatra herself took the dramatic way out. But in between, these liaisons weren't just personal, they were statecraft. Pillows and politics tangled into one. Daily life, for ordinary Egyptians, was more practical. Contraception, for example, was attempted with an array of substances that range from mildly unpleasant to truly terrible ideas. Crocodile dung mixed with honey was one recipe. I'll let you imagine the logistics. Other mixtures included acacia gum, dates, and fiber plugs. Were they effective? Possibly. At least effective enough to keep the tradition alive for centuries. Pregnancy and childbirth, meanwhile, were seen as highly spiritual events. Amulets, incantations, and protective statues were common. Gods like Taweret, the hippo-shaped goddess of fertility, were called upon to watch over mothers. The irony is that despite all the charms and prayers, childbirth remained as dangerous as ever. Medicine was limited, infections were common, and infant mortality was high. But the Egyptians, ever practical, simply folded this into their world view. Life was fragile and the gods mysterious. Now, we can't talk about Egyptian intimacy without mentioning one of the strangest royal practices, ceremonial role play. Some texts suggest that, at least on occasion, the pharaoh was expected to perform rituals symbolically reenacting the union of gods. In some versions, his queen joined him. In others, he played both parts alone. The records are vague, perhaps mercifully so, but it paints a picture of kingship as one long, exhausting theater production, with divine approval hanging on your willingness to improvise. And then there's the issue of the afterlife. Egyptians didn't believe desire ended with death. Tombs contained erotic imagery, and some texts suggested couples would continue their relationships beyond the grave. Mummification itself, with its focus on preserving every part of the body, had a kind of intimacy to it. though one suspects not the kind most people would volunteer for. Let's drift for a moment into the wider world of royal oddities. Because Egypt wasn't the only place where rulers tangled themselves in strange dynastic webs. The habit of marrying within the family would later pop up in medieval and early modern Europe, with consequences ranging from the mildly absurd to the downright tragic. But Egypt set the early model. Kings and queens elevated above ordinary morality, bound by rituals that made their most private moments a matter of state interest. It's a reminder that power doesn't just corrupt, it complicates. It takes the simple act of two people sharing a life and turns it into a myth, a ritual, or a symbol heavy enough to crush the humans underneath. So what was sex really like in ancient Egypt? Well, awkward, symbolic, occasionally practical, and often bizarre. Just like everywhere else in history. The difference is that the Egyptians left us enough papyri, graffiti, and temple carvings to remind us that they weren't so different from us after all. They loved, they argued, they experimented, and they complained. The only real difference is that their bedtime stories happen to involve crocodile dung. Let's drift gently onward now, leaving the hot sands of the Nile behind. Our next stop will carry us forward in time across the Mediterranean into the gilded palaces and grim nursery rooms of European royalty, where intimacy once again became less about love and more about dynasties. Because if you thought sibling marriage in Egypt was peculiar, just wait until we wander into the Habsburgs. Got it. Let's sink softly back in and continue the sleepy monologue. Part 2 will carry on from ancient Egypt, drifting further into royal oddities and keeping the same calm, sardonic tone. About 1600 and 800 words, so it stays within the flow. Part 2. From Nile rituals to royal bedrooms of Europe, so. When we left off, we were standing beside the Nile, squinting at papyri, and wondering why on earth crocodile dung ever seemed like a good idea for contraception. It's a question that probably kept more than one Egyptian midwife awake at night. But history doesn't stop at the riverbank. Tonight we're drifting onward, out of the temples and festivals of Egypt and into the drafty stone castles and gilded palaces of Europe. Because if there's one thing royalty has never quite managed, it's handling their private lives with dignity. Let's begin gently with the medieval mindset. For most Europeans in the Middle Ages, sex wasn't cosmic like in Egypt. It was suspicious. The Church, in its infinite wisdom, spent centuries writing long, tedious lists of when you weren't supposed to have relations. Sundays? No. Feast days? Certainly not. Lent? Don't even think about it. Advent? Absolutely not. Fridays? That's a no. Saturdays? Technically also questionable. Which left maybe a Tuesday in June if you were lucky. The reasoning was, of course, theological, but the effect was to make ordinary people constantly guilty about something entirely normal, which naturally made it more interesting. Royalty, however, didn't quite play by the same rules. For kings and queens, intimacy was rarely about desire. It was dynastic. A royal bed wasn't just a bed. It was an extension of the throne room. Every child born was a potential heir, an alliance, or, if you were unlucky, a war waiting to happen. And unlike ordinary couples, royalty didn't always get privacy. Marriages were public events, sometimes sealed with ceremonies that were frankly intrusive. In some traditions, Members of the court would literally witness the bedding of the bride and groom, just to make sure the marriage was properly consummated. Nothing says romance quite like your uncle holding a candle at the end of the bed. This brings us to the Plantagenets of England. They were not perhaps the most stable dynasty. King John, yes, the villain from Robin Hood, was infamous for his wandering eye. Chroniclers accused him of forcing himself on the wives and daughters of his barons, which didn't help his reputation as a terrible king. The fact that he also lost most of his French lands and annoyed nearly everyone probably mattered more politically, but the rumors of his personal life stuck. His descendants weren't much better. Edward II, for instance, is remembered less for governing and more for his very close male companions, which in medieval England was scandalous. Chroniclers sneered, nobles rebelled, and his queen, Isabella, eventually led an invasion against him. It wasn't simply about intimacy. Of course, it was about power. But Edward's affections gave his enemies plenty of fuel. And then there's Henry VIII, a man who believed so deeply in the sanctity of marriage that he had 6 of them. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was married to his brother before him, which already made the situation awkward. Henry spent years petitioning the Pope for an annulment, claiming the marriage was invalid because of this. When the Pope refused, Henry simply created his own church. Because when your love life collides with theology, why not rewrite religion itself? The problem was never really Henry's appetite. It was his obsession with producing a male heir. Catherine gave him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. Anne Boleyn gave him Elizabeth, later one of England's greatest monarchs, but again, no boys. Jane Seymour managed one, Edward VI, but died in the process. By the time Henry finished his 6th marriage, he had created an entire religious schism, executed 2 wives, and terrified nearly everyone around him. Not exactly a soothing family environment, but England wasn't alone. Across the Channel, French kings cultivated their own reputation for excess. Francis, I was so proud of his virility that he styled himself as the first gentleman of France. He hosted elaborate court entertainments where flirtation was practically mandatory. His successor, Henry II, was famously devoted not to his queen, Catherine de' Medici, but to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Diane was 20 years older than him, but apparently far more captivating than his actual wife. Catherine, understandably, spent much of her life feeling sidelined, though she eventually outlived them both and ruled France as regent. While kings collected mistresses, queens faced more scrutiny. Their job was not to be charming, but fertile. A queen who failed to produce heirs quickly became the subject of court gossip, whispered prayers, and occasionally outright divorce. Poor Anne of Austria, queen to Louis XIV, endured years of mockery for her supposed infertility, only to give birth later in life to Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Proof, perhaps, that patience occasionally pays off, though it must have been exhausting at the time. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued with their lives, largely ignored by chroniclers. Villagers married young, often for practical reasons. Love was a bonus, not an expectation. Most lived in small, crowded homes where privacy was non-existent. Whatever intimacy occurred did so within earshot of grandparents, siblings, and livestock. Hardly the stuff of romance novels. The church tried to police morality, but enforcement was patchy. Some records survive of priests scolding couples for carnal excess, a phrase vague enough to cover almost anything. The irony, of course, is that plenty of clergy ignored their own rules. Parish priests kept mistresses, monks strayed, and popes fathered illegitimate children. The disconnect between preaching and practice was as wide then as it is now. If we drift further forward into the Renaissance, things take a slightly more flamboyant turn. Italian courts, like those of the Medicis, embraced art, luxury, and elaborate pageantry. Behind the painted frescoes and marble halls, however, marriages were still arranged for advantage. Brides were often teenagers, grooms sometimes decades older. Romance was usually found outside the marriage bed through discreet affairs, poetry, and scandalous letters passed behind fans. The Medicis themselves were a perfect example. Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, filled Florence with art and philosophy. His descendants, however, became popes, dukes, and queens. Catherine de' Medici, whom we met earlier in France, brought her Italian flair to the French court, along with her love of astrology and elaborate banquets. Behind the scenes, though, her life was riddled with marital coldness, political strife, and whispered rumors about her role in dark plots. What's striking, across all these centuries, is how little joy royalty seemed to take in their personal lives. The richer the palace, the more suffocating the marriages. The more power at stake, the less room there was for affection. Love matches were rare. Duty came first. And when people did try to reach for happiness, an affair here, a secret lover there, it often ended badly. So perhaps the Egyptians weren't so strange after all. Yes, their rituals were odd. Yes, their papyri left us blushing illustrations, but at least they admitted that intimacy was powerful, messy, and divine. Medieval Europe, by contrast, tried to bury it under guilt and politics, only for it to keep slipping out through scandal after scandal, and that's where we'll pause, just for now. We've wandered from the sunlit sands of Egypt into the smoky great halls of Europe, listening to kings and queens stumble through marriages that were rarely happy and often disastrous. Next time, we'll drift further into the late dynasties, where inbreeding reached new heights, and the Habsburg jaw began its slow march across portraits and palaces, because nothing says romance quite like marrying your cousin's cousin's cousin. Again, the Habsburg jaw and other genetic adventures, so we've left the candle-lit chambers of the Tudors and the gossip-filled corridors of Renaissance courts. Let's drift now into the echoing, drafty palaces of Central Europe, because here we find one of history's longest-running dynastic experiments in, let's politely call it, keeping things close, the Habsburgs, a family that somehow managed to rule vast swaths of Europe for centuries, while simultaneously narrowing their own family tree to the width of a pencil. At first, it almost made sense. The Habsburgs started small in what is now Switzerland. Through careful marriages, always marriages, rarely wars, they accumulated territories like a particularly ambitious game of Monopoly. By the 16th century, they ruled Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Low Countries, Spain, and large parts of Italy. They even had a finger in the New World, thanks to Spain's colonial adventures. All this was impressive. But it came with a catch. To hold their empire together, they relied on strategic marriages. And since they already controlled half of Europe, most suitable spouses were, well, already related. The solution? Just marry them anyway. Cousins, nieces, uncles, whatever the chart allowed. Over generations, the family tree stopped branching and started looping. The result was what became known, somewhat cruelly but also accurately, as the Habsburg jaw. Now, let's describe this feature in the calmest way possible. The jaw was prominent. Lower faces jutted forward, lips struggled to close, and chewing was apparently a daily battle. Portraits of Habsburg rulers from the 16th and 17th centuries show profiles that seem halfway to becoming pelicans. And remember, these are flattering portraits, painted by artists who knew their careers depended on pleasing the sitter. Reality was probably harsher. Scientists have since studied the Habsburgs' family lines and confirmed that, yes, their insistence on marrying close relatives likely caused this distinctive look, along with a host of other health problems. But the jaw was just the beginning. The dynasty became a living case study in what happens when you mix genealogy with stubborn tradition. Weak immune systems, high rates of infant mortality, infertility, mental instability, and a tendency for rulers to die young or live long but unhappily. Perhaps the most famous example was Charles II of Spain, the so-called Bewitched. Born in 1661, Charles was the product of generations of cousin marriage. His family tree was less a tree than a circle. By the time it reached him, the genetic odds were stacked against him. Charles suffered from seizures, digestive disorders, and what we'd now recognize as severe developmental issues. He couldn't walk properly until he was 8, couldn't speak clearly, and his education was minimal. He married twice but produced no children. Spain's vast empire depended on him, yet he could barely govern himself. When he died in 1700 at just 38 years old, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs ended with him. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, because of course Europe couldn't resist fighting over an empty throne. But not all Habsburgs were tragic in the same way. Some were simply eccentric. Take Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor in the late 16th century. Instead of focusing on ruling, Rudolf retreated into his private collections. He filled his palace in Prague with exotic animals, mechanical toys, and bizarre works of art. He surrounded himself with alchemists and astrologers, convinced he was on the verge of discovering eternal life. He wasn't. But his court became legendary as a place where science, mysticism, and a little madness mingled together. Then there was Maria Theresa in the 18th century. She managed to hold the Habsburg lands together with far more competence than many of her male relatives. She gave birth to 16 children, a feat in itself, and married them off strategically across Europe. One daughter, Marie Antoinette, ended up in France, where, as we know, things didn't go terribly well for her. Still, the Habsburg reputation always circled back to their marriages. They had an almost superstitious belief that by keeping their bloodlines pure, they were preserving their divine right to rule. What they were actually preserving was a set of increasingly fragile genes. The irony is that while they fought wars, signed treaties, and commanded empires, their dynasty was quietly sabotaging itself from within. No assassins needed. Just an endless series of cousin weddings and the slow grind of biology. What's oddly comforting as we drift through their history is that the Habsburgs weren't unique. Other dynasties fell into similar traps, but the Habsburgs took it further, longer, and more visibly than most. Their portraits became unintentional warnings about the risks of ignoring basic genetics, and yet for all their fragility, they lasted a remarkably long time. From the late Middle Ages until the early 20th century, Habsburgs ruled somewhere in Europe. They presided over the Holy Roman Empire, then Austria-Hungary. They were toppled only in 1918, at the end of World War I, which means their dynasty outlasted kingdoms, revolutions, and empires, despite its own internal weaknesses. Perhaps that's the ultimate irony. They survived not because of their choices, but in spite of them, like a delicate antique vase, constantly tipping but never quite breaking, until at last the world around them changed too much. As we let the Habsburgs fade into the background, it's worth pausing on one simple truth. Power does not make life easier. Often it makes it stranger. For the Habsburgs, their obsession with purity and tradition turned intimacy into a dynastic trap. They wanted to preserve themselves forever. Instead, they preserved a medical case study. So the next time you see a portrait of a king with a jaw that looks more like a small shelf, remember, that wasn't just bad painting. That was history written on a face. Let's drift gently now, away from Vienna and Madrid, and over to another dynasty famous for its personal drama, the Tudors and their endless marital experiments. Henry VIII, with his 6 wives, provides a slightly different bedtime story. Less about genetics, more about egos. Henry VIII and the Tudors' bedtime troubles. By now, we've wandered through the tombs of Egypt, the candle-lit alcoves of Rome, and the fragile halls of the Habsburgs. But if there's one dynasty that insists on inserting itself into every conversation about romance, marriage, and scandal, it's the Tudors. And no Tudor looms larger, literally and figuratively, than Henry VIII, a man of contradictions. Henry VIII wasn't always the red-bearded, swollen king we picture from portraits. When he first came to the throne in 1509, he was tall, athletic, and charming. He could joust, dance, compose music, and speak several languages. Women adored him, courtiers admired him, and foreign ambassadors reported back that he was the perfect Renaissance prince. But beneath the charm, Henry carried a simmering insecurity, the desperate need for a male heir. It was the obsession of his life and the doom of several women, because the Tudors were a new dynasty. His father, Henry VII, had won the crown in battle only a generation earlier. The Tudors had no long, ancient bloodline like the Habsburgs. They were newcomers, and newcomers must secure their legacy. That meant sons, healthy, surviving, unarguable heirs. Wife number 1, Catherine of Aragon. Henry's first marriage was to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella. She was originally married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, but he died young. Henry married her instead, a political match meant to keep England tied to Spain. At first, the marriage seemed affectionate. Catherine was dignified, pious, and well-educated. But the years wore on, and tragedy followed. Catherine suffered multiple stillbirths and infant deaths. Only one child survived, Mary. Henry began to see Catherine not as a partner, but as an obstacle. His dynasty still had no secure male heir. He convinced himself that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. He needed out. But divorce wasn't so simple. England was Catholic, the Pope's authority absolute. Henry begged, argued, even bullied the Pope to annul the marriage. The Pope refused, partly because Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had political sway in Rome. So Henry did something drastic. He broke away from Rome. He declared himself head of the Church of England. It was less about theology and more about bed sheets. Wife number 2, Anne Boleyn. The catalyst for this break was Anne Boleyn, a woman unlike Catherine. Sharp-tongued, witty, and politically astute, Anne refused to be Henry's mistress. If he wanted her, it had to be as queen. Henry was smitten. He poured love letters and promises onto parchment. Finally, in 1533, he married her. Anne soon became pregnant. This, Henry believed, was it. The long-awaited son. But the child was a girl, Elizabeth. Anne miscarried several times afterward, one possibly a boy. Henry's infatuation soured into suspicion. Whispers of witchcraft and treason floated through court. In 1536, Anne was arrested, accused of adultery and incest. Historians largely agree the charges were fabricated. Still, she was executed on Tower Green with a French swordsman, chosen for his clean strike. Elizabeth, the daughter Henry nearly discarded, would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs. But Henry could not see that far. He only saw failure. Wife number 3, Jane Seymour. Within days, Henry married Jane Seymour. Gentle, quiet, and obedient. She seemed the opposite of fiery Anne. Henry adored her for one reason above all. She gave him a son. Edward VI was born in 1537. Henry's joy was unbounded, finally a male heir. But Jane died shortly after childbirth. Henry wore black for months. He would later call her his true wife, though their marriage had lasted barely a year. Edward, though, was frail from birth. The Tudor problem, dynastic insecurity, remained. Wife number 4, Anne of Cleves by. 1540, Henry's advisers sought another foreign alliance. They arranged a marriage to Anne of Cleves, a German princess. Henry was shown a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein. When Anne arrived in person, Henry was appalled. He declared she looked nothing like her portrait. "I like her not," were his alleged words. But politics forced him to go through with it. The marriage was never consummated, and Henry had it annulled within months. Still, Anne played her cards wisely. She accepted the annulment gracefully, received a generous settlement, and lived comfortably in England as the king's beloved sister. Compared to the fates of other wives, Anne came out ahead. Wife number 5, Catherine Howard. Next came Catherine Howard. Young and vivacious, at least 3 decades Henry's junior. The king, now overweight and plagued by ulcers, saw her as a spark of youth. But Catherine was reckless. She had lovers before her marriage, and rumors suggested she continued them afterward. In 1542, she was executed for adultery at just 19. Henry was devastated but unrelenting. His quest for stability consumed anyone who faltered. Wife number 6, Catherine Parr, finally came. Catherine Parr, practical and intelligent. She nursed Henry through his declining years, managed to outlive him, and acted as stepmother to his children. She survived, which in the Tudor court was an accomplishment in itself. The aftermath, Henry left behind 3 heirs, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. All would rule. None would leave children. The dynasty ended with Elizabeth I in 1603, passing the crown to the Scottish Stuarts. Henry's marriages, meant to secure the Tudor line, ultimately destroyed it. His obsession with control left England with religious upheaval, political scars, and enough scandal to fill every historian's bedtime lecture for centuries. The human side, what's striking, drifting through these stories, is how little intimacy had to do with love. For Henry, marriage was politics by another name. Wives were queens, but also pawns, symbols, and scapegoats. Each marriage carried the weight of a kingdom. And yet, in the midst of executions and annulments, there were fleeting moments of tenderness. Letters between Henry and Anne Boleyn showed genuine passion. His grief over Jane Seymour seems sincere. Even Henry, wrapped in power, couldn't escape the ordinary human desire for affection and legacy. As we leave Henry's court, the clatter of armor fading, we see a pattern forming. Dynasties rise and fall, but their private lives are always entangled with public fate. A king's insecurity becomes a nation's upheaval. A queen's childbirth becomes a country's crisis. The Tudors remind us that intimacy, when tied to power, can never be private. It is always political, always historical, and now, with Henry laid to rest, bloated, paranoid, and surrounded by the echoes of 6 marriages, we drift toward the next chapter of royal entanglements. Because while England sorted through religious schisms and succession crises, across the Channel the French were busy writing their own stories of desire, decadence, and downfall. Versailles and the French Theater of Desire. Hey everyone, if your eyes are still open after Henry VIII's 6-ring circus of matrimony, you're doing better than most of his wives. But tonight, we're moving softly across the Channel to a palace built not just as a home, but as a stage. Versailles, the Palace of Mirrors. And Mirrors Versailles wasn't really designed to be lived in. It was designed to be seen. Louis XIV, the Sun King, wanted to create a palace where every hallway, every chandelier, every gold leaf whispered, "I am the center of the universe." It was theater. Politics performed as architecture. And within this elaborate set, intimacy was staged too. Who the king visited in the night mattered just as much as which minister he appointed in the day. For courtiers, love was never private. It was strategic. A well-timed affair could elevate a family for generations. A poorly timed one could land you in exile or worse in the Bastille. Louis XIV. The Sun King and his shadows. Louis XIV reigned for 72 years, the longest in European history. His reign was marked by endless wars, ceaseless building projects, and carefully choreographed rituals of power. But his personal life was just as crowded. Louis had one official wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, a quiet and rather overlooked figure in the glittering court. She dutifully bore children, most of whom died young, and otherwise faded into the background. The real drama swirled around Louis's mistresses. The mistresses' court Versailles practically had an annex for royal lovers. Official mistresses were recognized, housed, and often wielded political influence. Madame de Montespan, for example, was witty, ambitious, and held Louis's attention for over a decade. She bore him several children and became one of the most powerful women in France. But her downfall came with scandal. Whispers of black magic and poisoned love potions tainted her reputation. Eventually, Louis cooled, and she retired into piety. Her replacement, Madame de Maintenon, played a subtler game. Pious, reserved, and maternal, she soothed Louis in his later years. Some believe he even married her secretly after his wife died. It was never confirmed, but Versailles buzzed with rumors. Etiquette of the bedroom at Versailles, even the king's bed was political. There was an official rising ceremony each morning called the lever, where courtiers watched him wake, dress, and eat breakfast. A similar ritual, the coucher, accompanied him going to bed. Privacy didn't exist in the way we imagine it. Intimacy was a performance, and proximity to the royal body, whether helping him slip on stockings or being admitted to his bedchamber, was a mark of favor. Of course, behind the layers of protocol, the king still slipped away for trysts, but even those became public knowledge within hours. Versailles was a palace of whispers, courtiers and their games. It wasn't just the king. The nobility, trapped in Versailles like decorative birds in a gilded cage, also played their games of affection and intrigue. Marriage was usually arranged, coldly political. Love affairs filled the gaps, but the court was small, the walls thin, and secrets impossible. A love letter misdelivered, a glance caught at a masked ball, and entire families could fall from favor. Some courtiers embraced the absurdity. The Duc de Lauzun famously juggled romances like a performer until his arrogance earned him imprisonment. Others fumbled disastrously, like poor nobles who mistook a flirtation for real affection and ended up exiled to their dusty estates. The children of the King Louis XIV fathered many children, both legitimate and otherwise. The legitimate line suffered from disease, with several heirs dying before him. But his illegitimate children, those born from mistresses, often lived longer and thrived. Louis legitimized many of them, marrying them into noble families. It blurred the line between private passion and dynastic politics. For some nobles, marrying a royal bastard was more prestigious than an old aristocratic match. Blood was blood, even if it came from the wrong side of the sheets. The irony of grandeur. What's oddly soothing about Versailles is how impractical it all was. The palace dazzled with gold and mirrors, but the plumbing was atrocious. Perfume masked smells better left unmentioned. Courtiers endured freezing winters in drafty halls because to complain was to risk ridicule. Love and intimacy, too, were wrapped in layers of absurdity. A smile at a ball could ripple through ministries. A secret birth could shift alliances. Everyone performed. Everyone watched. Beyond Louis XIV, after Louis, the tradition continued. His successor, Louis XV, was known for his endless mistresses, including Madame de Pompadour, who not only entertained him, but also shaped art, fashion, and diplomacy. Later, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette would find themselves entangled in their own far more tragic drama, where every rumor of their private life became political fuel for revolution. But in the Sun King's time, the palace was still the theater, the courtiers the actors, and intimacy one of the most powerful scripts. Drifting away. So, as we drift away from Versailles, past glittering mirrors and over-decorated fountains, what remains? The idea that power and passion were never separate. A king's mistress could decide a minister's fate. A royal's child could reconfigure alliances. And a palace meant to embody grandeur became, at its heart, a gossip mill. The lesson, if there is one, is simple. Even under chandeliers, humanity is messy. Desire doesn't obey etiquette, and politics doesn't respect privacy. Versailles was both a dream and a prison, a place where the heart and crown could never fully part. And so, with the soft echoes of harps in candlelit halls, we close this chapter. The French have had their turn in our quiet wandering. Next, we'll slip gently into another world entirely, the loves, rules, and oddities of medieval Europe outside the glittering courts, where intimacy was less about gold-leafed ceilings and more about survival, superstition, and occasionally goats. Love, marriage, and haystacks in medieval Europe. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. We've lingered in the tombs of Egypt, wandered through Roman banquets, tiptoed around Henry VIII's marital graveyard, and even eavesdropped on the whispered scandals of Versailles. But tonight, let's step outside the royal courts. Because history isn't just kings and queens losing their heads or rearranging their bedrooms. Most people in medieval Europe had far less glamorous, far more practical arrangements. Marriage as a business deal. For peasants, marriage was rarely about romance. It was about survival. A good marriage wasn't measured by candlelit confessions. It was measured by land, livestock, and whether your future spouse's family had enough grain stored for winter. The church technically required consent between bride and groom. Two people simply saying, "I take you as my husband, and I take you as my wife," in front of witnesses, was enough. But in reality, families often nudged things along, strongly, because of course they did. Daughters were bargaining chips, sons were heirs, and sometimes a pig was more important than passion. Weddings. Less white dress. More ale the idea of a white wedding gown. Pure Victorian invention. In medieval villages, brides wore their best tunic, whatever color it happened to be. Red was popular, symbolizing luck. Blue was linked to the Virgin Mary, so it was suitably holy. White was impractical unless you wanted to show off stains before the feast had even started. Ceremonies were usually held at the church door, not inside. Only afterward did the couple step into the church for a blessing. The reception wasn't a carefully planned event with floral arrangements. It was ale, bread, meat if you were lucky, and dancing that occasionally devolved into brawls. The medieval motto seemed to be, "Celebrate until you forget the lack of plumbing." The bed problem one of the stranger medieval customs was called bedding. After the wedding feast, the couple was escorted to bed. Sometimes the entire community followed. They didn't just tuck the couple in. They watched, cheered, and occasionally threw things. Yes, it was as awkward as it sounds. Privacy was a luxury few peasants had anyway. Families often slept in one room, children included, with everyone crammed together for warmth. Curtains around the bed were more symbolic than effective. Romance in this setting required either extreme creativity or a complete lack of shame. The church's rule book. The church loomed large over medieval intimacy. Certain days of the week were off-limits. Fridays, for example, were considered inappropriate because of Christ's crucifixion. Sundays were for God, not for cuddling. There were also prohibitions during Lent, Advent, and other holy seasons. If you're keeping track, that left fewer acceptable days than one might imagine. And even on those, the church advised moderation. Clerics produced lengthy handbooks warning against certain positions, certain times, and even too much enjoyment. Because naturally, if something felt good, it was probably sinful. peasant realities. Despite all these rules, peasants carried on in their own way. Love matches weren't unheard of. Some couples clearly cared for one another deeply, though affection was often expressed in practical gestures, repairing a roof, mending clothes, or sharing bread. Children came frequently, though infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Families had to balance joy with the grim reality that many children wouldn't survive past infancy. It created a rhythm of life where intimacy wasn't just pleasure or passion. It was tied directly to survival, courtship, and singing. For young people, courtship rituals could be surprisingly lively. Folk traditions included singing contests, gift exchanges, or even games that were thinly veiled excuses for physical closeness. In some regions, a practice called bundling allowed courting couples to lie in bed together, fully clothed, sometimes with a board placed between them. The theory was that they could talk all night and bond. In practice, well, let's just say teenagers haven't changed much in 1,000 years. Scandals in the village affairs and scandals weren't limited to kings. Adultery in a small medieval village could be explosive. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and punishments were harsh. Fines, public shaming, and even being paraded through the streets wearing humiliating symbols were possible. There were also curious double standards. A wife caught straying was treated as a threat to property and inheritance. A husband caught wandering usually got a warning, unless he embarrassed someone powerful. Medical theories and misunderstandings, medieval medical texts are filled with fascinatingly incorrect ideas. Women were thought to be colder in temperament, requiring heat, conveniently provided by men. Too much intimacy, doctors warned, could cause exhaustion, nosebleeds, or even madness. One belief held that women needed to experience pleasure in order to conceive. This at least gave some justification for considering their satisfaction, though how widely it was honored is another question entirely. Herbal remedies for fertility, love potions, and charms circulated widely. Some involved plants we now know have real hormonal effects. Others involved, well, more questionable ingredients such as powdered animal parts. The role of animals. It's impossible to talk about medieval households without mentioning animals. Cows, chickens, goats, and dogs shared close quarters with families. This meant that intimacy happened not in private bedrooms, but in spaces where livestock snorted in the corner. It doesn't sound romantic, but it was simply life. For medieval people, the line between the human and animal household was blurred. It shaped their concepts of marriage, fertility, and even humor. Jokes and songs from the period are full of farmyard comparisons that modern listeners might find a little too earthy. The thread of tenderness, amid all the rules, the awkwardness, and the survival-driven priorities, tenderness did exist. A peasant husband repairing his wife's shoes, a wife saving the softest part of the loaf for her husband, parents grieving the loss of children. These reveal the depth of feeling beneath the practical arrangements. It's easy to reduce medieval marriage to contracts and customs. But people still laughed, still teased, still found comfort in each other's arms, even if those arms were stiff from farm work and the mattress was more straw than softness. Drifting. When we look at medieval Europe outside the palaces, we don't see silk sheets or jeweled mistresses. We see patched tunics, muddy boots, and shared households. Intimacy was raw, less private, but in some ways more honest. It wasn't about dynastic glory. It was about surviving another winter together. And with that, let's gently leave the smoky cottages and uneven floors of the medieval village behind. Ahead lies another world, a time of superstition, scandal, and sudden cultural change. The Renaissance, where passion collided with philosophy and desire was painted on chapel ceilings. Renaissance, passions, and Reformation rules. Hey everyone, welcome back. We've wandered past medieval haystacks, listened in on Versailles gossip, and even sat through Henry VIII's marital roulette. Tonight we find ourselves somewhere brighter, a world of frescoes, philosophers, and printing presses. The Renaissance, a time when intimacy was celebrated in art, dissected by theologians, and occasionally punished by zealous reformers. So let's drift slowly through candlelit Italian studios, echoing Protestant sermons and the odd love sonnet or two. Love on a pedestal. The Renaissance loved to put passion on a pedestal. Literally. Sculptors carved the human form with newfound admiration. Painters filled chapels and palaces with bodies that were not just functional but beautiful. Michelangelo's David, for instance, wasn't just about biblical courage. It was also about perfect anatomy, idealized muscle, and an admiration of form that medieval stonecutters would never have dared. In Florence, love poetry flourished. Petrarch's sonnets to his beloved Laura practically invented the European love poem tradition. He never actually had a relationship with her. She may not have even known he existed. But that didn't stop him from immortalizing her in 14-line bursts of longing. Romantic yearning, it seemed, was more fun when unattainable. Marriage in Renaissance cities for ordinary people. Marriage was still practical, but urban life added twists. In the bustling city-states of Italy, marriage contracts became complex documents involving dowries, inheritances, and political alliances. A daughter wasn't just a bride. She was an investment, wrapped in gold coins and linen chests. Dowries could be ruinously expensive. Families went into debt for them, and convents were often used as an alternative. If you had too many daughters, you couldn't marry them all off. Some were simply parked in nunneries, not always voluntarily. Romance might appear in poetry, but in the piazzas and markets, it was mostly arithmetic, courtesans, the Renaissance exception, and yet, alongside this careful accounting, the Renaissance celebrated courtesans. In Venice especially, they became cultural icons. Courtesans were educated, witty, fashionable, and often wealthier than respectable wives. They hosted salons where poetry, politics, and philosophy mingled with flirtation. Figures like Veronica Franco weren't just companions, they were published poets. She defended women's intellect in print while also navigating the dangers of reputation. Courtesans revealed the strange contradiction of the Renaissance, the official line of piety and virtue, and the unofficial celebration of wit, beauty, and sensuality. The Reformation crashes. And while Italy painted cherubs and nudes, Northern Europe was undergoing a different transformation. The Reformation. Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door in 1517, and suddenly, questions about indulgences and papal authority spilled into debates about family and marriage. For Luther and other reformers, marriage was not a sacrament in the Catholic sense. It was a practical, God-ordained arrangement, and celibacy was no longer the higher calling. Monks and nuns were encouraged to marry. Luther himself married Katharina von Bora, a runaway nun. Their household became a model for Protestant domestic life, a pious, busy home full of children, chickens, and endless guests. Protestant intimacy was meant to be grounded, respectable, and centered around family. Pleasure within marriage wasn't condemned, but it was heavily framed as duty, producing children and avoiding temptation. Catholic counterpoint, of course. The Catholic Church wasn't about to give up its authority. The Counter-Reformation doubled down on discipline. Confession manuals became even more detailed. Priests interrogated parishioners on the most personal aspects of their married lives, ensuring they stayed within proper bounds. It was as if both sides, Catholic and Protestant, were competing to regulate what happened after sunset. The Renaissance celebrated the beauty of the body in art, while the Reformation tried to legislate it in life. Renaissance medicine and myths. Meanwhile, doctors still clung to classical humoral theory. Passion, they said, had physical consequences. Too much could cause fevers. Too little could cause melancholy. Women were thought to be naturally more lustful because their bodies were colder and therefore craved heat. Remedies abounded. Some were herbal. Fennel, mint, and anise were popular. Others involved frankly bizarre recipes, powdered gemstones, for example, or concoctions made with animal organs. It was medical science at its most hopeful and least effective. Scandals of the elite, naturally elite families found ways to scandalize everyone. The Medici of Florence, those bankers turned dukes, became infamous, not just for patronizing Michelangelo, but for messy private lives. Affairs, illegitimate children, and poisoned rivals filled their history. Popes, too, had reputations that didn't quite match their holy titles. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, openly acknowledged his children and placed them in positions of power. The Borgia family became synonymous with intrigue, lust, and suspicion. Rumors, not all true but persistent, painted them as the villains of Renaissance Rome. A softer thread still, beyond scandals and sermons, there was genuine tenderness. Letters between Renaissance spouses show real affection. Husbands wrote anxiously about wives' health. Wives prayed for husbands' safe return from war. Parents mourned lost children with aching grief. Amid frescoes and reformations, the human need for closeness persisted, often in quiet, unrecorded moments. The irony of the age, the Renaissance is remembered as a rebirth of art, culture, and philosophy. But in the realm of intimacy, it was more of a patchwork. Beautiful ideals in marble and canvas, strict rules in pulpits and courtrooms, and the ordinary messiness of daily life underneath. If medieval Europe wrapped intimacy in superstition, the Renaissance wrapped it in marble statues and sermons. Either way, people still stumbled, still laughed, still made mistakes. Because of course they did, drifting toward the next age. And so, we leave the Renaissance behind, frescoes glowing faintly in candlelight and reformers' sermons echoing from pulpits. Ahead lies another shift, the Enlightenment, and eventually the Georgian and Victorian eras, an age where repression wore lace collars. Scandals were whispered behind fans, and intimacy became a battlefield between prudish ideals and very human reality. The world was shifting once again. After the long shadows of the Middle Ages, light began to creep back into Europe, spilling across frescoed walls and marble statues. The Renaissance, they called it, a rebirth of art, of ideas, and inevitably of the way people thought about love, passion, and marriage. It was a time when intimacy was painted onto chapel ceilings, carved into statues, and whispered about in salons. Bodies were no longer only vessels of sin, but also objects of beauty, worthy of admiration, even reverence. Michelangelo's David stood not just as a biblical hero, but as a celebration of perfect form, a sculpture that was as much about desire as it was about faith. In Florence, the poets filled their notebooks with sonnets of longing. Petrarch, forever sighing for his distant Laura, set the tone for centuries of romantic yearning. She may not have known him at all, yet his words turned her into an eternal muse. For many, love during the Renaissance was something best experienced in longing rather than in fulfillment. But life on the streets of Florence or Venice was not quite so poetic. Marriage remained, as it had always been, a practical matter. Dowries weighed heavily on families, sometimes so heavily that parents pushed daughters into convents rather than face ruin. A bride was an investment as much as a partner, her worth measured in coins, linens, and land deeds. Behind the painted ceilings and sonnets there was plenty of arithmetic, and yet even here exceptions thrived. The Renaissance saw the rise of the courtesan, especially in Venice, where women of wit, education, and beauty could wield remarkable influence. They hosted salons, exchanged poems with leading men, and wrote their own verses, like Veronica Franco, who defended women's intelligence while also making her living from companionship. In them, one sees the Renaissance contradiction most clearly. A world that officially preached restraint but unofficially adored sophistication, sensuality, and charm. As Italy filled its palaces with nudes, Northern Europe was being shaken by something else entirely. The Reformation swept through towns and villages, carried by Luther's hammer blows and the ink of newly printed pamphlets. The Reformers saw marriage not as a holy sacrament, but as a practical bond, blessed by God but stripped of the mystical aura the Catholic Church had wrapped around it. Celibacy was no longer the higher calling. In fact, priests and nuns were encouraged to marry. Luther himself set the example, wedding Katharina von Bora, once a nun, and building a busy household filled with children, gardens, and bustling domestic life. For Protestants, marriage became a godly duty. Intimacy a proper part of married life, though framed in terms of responsibility rather than passion. The Catholic Church, unwilling to cede control, pushed back with its Counter-Reformation. If Protestants loosened some rules, Catholics tightened theirs. Confessors asked increasingly detailed questions about the most private parts of married life, ensuring every act fit within the Church's moral code. It was as if the Renaissance adored the body in art, while religion sought to regulate it in life. One side painting cherubs and goddesses, while the other wrote manuals of sin and penance. Doctors and philosophers weighed in too, still relying on the old humoral theories. Too much desire could overheat the body. Too little could bring melancholy. Women, some physicians insisted, were naturally more lustful because their bodies were colder and sought heat. Remedies for imbalance included herbs like fennel or mint, though others were stranger, powdered gems, animal parts, or elaborate rituals that promised little more than hope. Even as statues and poems celebrated the human form, medicine clung stubbornly to its ancient guesses. The elite, as ever, found ways to scandalize. In Florence, the Medici family filled its palaces not only with art, but with intrigue, affairs, and illegitimate children. In Rome, The papal court produced its own share of rumors, with the Borgia family at the center. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, openly acknowledged his children, elevating them to power and fueling endless whispers of lust, poison, and betrayal. Whether all the tales were true mattered less than the reputation they created. The Renaissance papacy was as much a stage for drama as for prayer. And yet, beyond the politics and the scandals, there were moments of simple tenderness. Letters survived from husbands to wives, full of worry over sickness or distance. Wives wrote back with prayers for safe returns. Parents mourned their children in words that are as raw as any modern grief. Beneath the marble, beneath the sermons, people still sought the same closeness they always had. The small comforts of hand in hand, of whispered words at night, of love that was less about ideals and more about survival. The Renaissance is remembered for its brilliance, its art, its rediscovery of classical wisdom. But in matters of intimacy, it was a patchwork of contradictions. Marble statues glorified the naked body, while priests condemned it from pulpits. Poets pined for untouchable lovers, while merchants bartered dowries. Courtesans sparkled in salons, while wives kept households running on narrow budgets. Ordinary people, as always, lived somewhere in between the rules and the realities. As the candles flicker lower, we leave the Renaissance behind with its painted ceilings, its sonnets and its contradictions. Ahead lies a new world of salons and science, of powdered wigs and reason, of rules and repression dressed in lace. The Enlightenment waits, and beyond it, the Victorians with their buttoned collars and whispered scandals. But those belong to another night. The 19th century opened with the weight of factories, smoke, and steel pressing against old cobbled streets. Carriages gave way to locomotives, cities swelled, and everywhere the rhythms of daily life were changing. With this shift came a new atmosphere around intimacy, one that was at once prudish and quietly obsessed. The Victorians, especially in Britain, are remembered for buttoned collars, stiff manners, and an almost comical discomfort with the human body. And yet, beneath the starch and lace, there was a fascination that never truly disappeared, only redirected into whispers, euphemisms, and the occasional scandal. Publicly, marriage was treated as the cornerstone of respectability. Husbands were expected to be providers, wives paragons of virtue, and together they formed the image of domestic stability. The family home became almost sacred, framed as a moral refuge from the smoky chaos of industrial cities. In practice, though, this vision often strained under the weight of reality. Men found themselves drawn to brothels that proliferated in urban centers, while women quietly exchanged advice in kitchens and parlors, passing on folk remedies and unspoken truths. Doctors published manuals that spoke of reproduction with clinical detachment, carefully avoiding anything too explicit, as though plain words themselves might cause a scandal. The tension between restraint and desire expressed itself in curious ways. Furniture makers produced covers for piano legs, lest the sight of a carved curve be deemed too suggestive. Novels skirted carefully around passion, replacing it with longing glances and trembling hands. Yet pornography flourished in underground markets, sold discreetly to those willing to pay. The more society claimed to suppress desire, the more it seemed to bubble up in hidden corners, as though repression itself had become a fuel. Among the upper classes, affairs and scandals rippled just beneath the surface. Aristocratic men maintained mistresses while presenting their wives at soirees as models of dignity. Women, expected to be paragons of virtue, occasionally broke the mold, and when they did, society judged them far more harshly than their male counterparts. Rumors circulated through drawing rooms and newspapers, making private indiscretions a kind of public entertainment. Respectability was everything, but appearances were often fragile. Science, now more confident than ever, offered its own pronouncements. Doctors wrote anxiously about the supposed dangers of self-abuse, warning young men and women of dire consequences from blindness to madness. Pamphlets circulated with advice on how to prevent such behavior, though the very act of writing about it only drew attention. At the same time, early sexologists began to catalog human desire with the ambition of naturalists collecting specimens. What had once been left to poets and priests was now the subject of questionnaires, case studies, and bound volumes filled with clinical prose. Industrial society brought new challenges. In crowded cities, poverty, overwork, and disease-strained families. Child labor left its mark on households, and marriages often bore the weight of economic necessity more than romance. And yet even here, tenderness survived. Letters between separated spouses speak of longing and quiet devotion. Diaries record small acts of care. A hand held at a sickbed, a note left on a kitchen table. Behind the cliches of repression lay the same range of human experiences that had always been there, softened by time, sharpened by circumstance. Across the Atlantic, America wrestled with its own contradictions. Puritan legacies lingered, emphasizing morality and restraint, even as frontier life demanded practical partnerships built on survival and resilience. Later, in the booming cities of the Gilded Age, wealth and display brought their own excesses, mirroring the aristocratic scandals of Europe. Respectability was prized, but temptation was never far away. The Victorians are remembered, often unfairly, as uniquely repressed, but their world was more complicated. They lived at a crossroads, old religious moralities still heavy in the air, new scientific voices growing louder, and industrial modernity reshaping daily existence. They struggled to reconcile ideals of virtue with realities of desire. They built a culture that cloaked passion in layers of fabric and euphemism, yet could not quite silence it. As the century waned, cracks began to show. The rise of psychology, the influence of thinkers like Freud, and the changing role of women hinted at new ways of speaking, even if hesitantly, about what had long been hidden. The age of buttoned collars was giving way to something looser, more modern, more willing to name things directly. But for now, the Victorian night lingered, full of gaslight, fog, and the soft creak of carriages carrying secrets through darkened streets. The Sexual Revolution, 1960s and 1970s. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting into one of the noisiest decades in modern history, though we'll approach it quietly, like slipping into a crowded room but choosing a seat in the corner. The 1960s and 70s were often called the Sexual Revolution. That phrase tends to conjure up swirling images of flower crowns, disco balls, and people smiling far too confidently in bell-bottoms. But underneath the cliches, these decades really did mark a profound shift in how intimacy was lived, debated, and even legislated. So, Settle in. Dim the lights. Let's drift slowly through the age of tie-dye and mirrored disco balls, where freedom, fear, and questionable decisions coexisted in equal measure. A little pill that changed everything. The revolution began quietly, in pharmacies of all places. In 1960, the FDA approved the birth control pill, a small, unassuming tablet swallowed with water that gave women unprecedented control over their reproductive lives. For the first time in history, large numbers of people could reliably separate intimacy from pregnancy. This was a cultural earthquake disguised as medical innovation. By the late 1960s, millions of women were using the pill, and its impact rippled far beyond bedrooms. Relationships shifted, expectations shifted, and of course, outrage shifted into full gear. Religious leaders condemned it as unnatural. Conservative politicians muttered vague warnings about moral collapse, and yet its popularity only grew. A reminder that private choices have a way of quietly reshaping entire societies. The hippies. And free love, if the pill gave people tools, counterculture gave them slogans. The hippies of the 1960s, with their flowing hair, tie-dye shirts, and patchouli oil, embraced the idea of free love. The phrase sounded noble, liberating even. In practice, it often meant a lot of very earnest 20-somethings in crowded communes discovering that sharing is easier said than done. Communes promised utopias where everything, food, chores, and partners, could be shared in equal measure. Some lasted weeks. A few limped along for years. Most collapsed under the weight of unpaid bills, personality clashes, and the awkward reality that someone still had to take out the trash. But free love wasn't just a fad. It cracked open the notion that intimacy had to be confined to marriage. Whether one saw it as liberating or irresponsible, it planted questions that still linger today about what love and commitment should mean. Music, mud, and Woodstock. No cultural shift is complete without a soundtrack, and the 1960s had plenty. Rock and roll, once scandalous for a swiveling Elvis, now expanded into psychedelia. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Janis Joplin, and Jimi Hendrix became icons, not just for their music, but for embodying lifestyles that challenged every buttoned-up sensibility of the older generation. Festivals like Woodstock in 1969 turned music into mass ritual. Nearly 500,000 people trudged through mud, rain, and questionable hygiene, sharing food, blankets, and often more. For the young, it was liberation. For their parents, it was evidence of impending apocalypse. Both sides, in their own way, were exaggerating. Politics in the bedroom. The sexual revolution was never just about pleasure. It was also about politics. Feminist voices grew louder, demanding not just access to contraception, but recognition of women's autonomy within relationships. The phrase women's liberation wasn't just about jobs or wages. It was also about who had the right to say yes or no, and when. Meanwhile, LGBTQ+ activism was stirring more openly. In 1969, the Stonewall riots erupted in New York City, after police raided a gay bar for what felt like the 1,000th time. The protests that followed marked the birth of the modern gay rights movement. Intimacy, long hidden in the shadows, was now part of public struggle. The 1970s. From revolution to excess as the 1960s faded into memory, the 1970s arrived with sequins and disco beats. The revolution didn't end. It just put on shinier clothes. Nightclubs became cultural landmarks, none more famous than Studio 54 in New York. Inside, celebrities, models, and ambitious strangers mingled under mirrored balls, indulging in an atmosphere where rules dissolved at the door. At the same time, Hollywood films began to push boundaries. On-screen intimacy became less implied and more, shall we say, demonstrated. Audiences gasped, tutted, and then bought more tickets. Magazines, too, expanded their reach, placing conversations about intimacy squarely in grocery store aisles. But the 70s weren't all glitter. Divorce rates soared as couples realized they no longer had to endure unhappy marriages. Therapists found themselves busy with clients trying to navigate this new landscape. Some called it liberation. Others called it chaos. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Backlash and countercurrents. Of course, revolutions rarely go unchallenged. Throughout the 1970s, conservative voices pushed back hard. Religious leaders warned of divine retribution. Politicians promised to restore traditional values. Newspapers ran anxious headlines about the decay of the family unit. For every disco anthem, there was a sermon calling it sinful. This tug-of-war was not new. History is full of liberation followed by backlash, but the intensity of it in these decades was striking. It revealed that intimacy was never just personal. It was always cultural, political, and deeply symbolic. The stage set for the 1980s, by the close of the 1970s, society had been reshaped. Pills, protests, discos, and divorce had all left their mark. Yet the story was far from over. The 1980s loomed, bringing with it neon lights, global pop culture, and a devastating health crisis that would once again force intimacy into the center of public debate. So let's drift toward that next decade, where liberation would meet limits, and freedom would find itself shadowed by fear. Neon nights and digital firsts. The 1980s and 1990s. Hey everyone, tonight we're sliding into the glow of neon lights, cassette tapes, and television sets that never seemed to switch off. The 1980s and 1990s were decades of extremes, flashy, loud, and constantly moving. Yet intimacy in this period was both liberated and shadowed by new fears. These years redefined relationships with technology, politics, and media all playing their part. So settle in. Let's wander slowly through mirrored nightclubs, suburban living rooms with oversized TVs, and the earliest chat rooms of the Internet age. The glitter and shadows of the 1980s. The 1980s opened with a strange mix of bold confidence and quiet dread. On one side, liberation from the 1960s and 70s was still echoing. Music, film, and fashion leaned heavily into sensuality. On the other side, a devastating epidemic was beginning to emerge. It would come to define intimacy for an entire generation. Let's begin with the bright lights first. Music videos arrived in force with the launch of MTV in 1981. Suddenly, songs were no longer just for the ears, they were for the eyes. And what the eyes got was often suggestive. Pop stars like Madonna and Prince built entire careers around playing with sensuality, pushing boundaries on what could be shown in primetime broadcasts. Fashion joined the show. Shoulder pads, sequined dresses, and brightly colored suits made everyone look like they were ready for either a board meeting or a dance floor. Everything was bigger, louder, and shinier. And intimacy, at least in how it was advertised, was often glossy, choreographed, and just a little bit artificial. The AIDS epidemic, but beneath the glitter, fear spread. The early 1980s saw the emergence of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. At first, little was understood about the disease. It spread silently, then visibly, devastating entire communities, particularly among gay men. Governments responded slowly, often with cruelty or denial. Stigma piled onto tragedy, and intimacy, something once celebrated as liberation, was now marked with fear. For many, this was not just a health crisis, but an existential one. The culture of free love that had blossomed in the 60s now faced a harsh, new reality. Intimacy carried dangers that could not be ignored. Activists rose to demand attention, research, and compassion. Groups like ACT UP staged protests, forcing the world to acknowledge what it would have rather ignored. The epidemic reshaped conversations in bedrooms, in clinics, and in politics. Condoms, once seen mainly as birth control, were now life-saving necessities. Schools and governments reluctantly began sex education campaigns. Some responded with compassion, others with judgment. Either way, intimacy could never again be separated from public health. Movies, magazines, and VHS tapes. While fear reshaped private life, media reshaped public life. Hollywood in the 80s leaned into spectacle. Romantic dramas like Dirty Dancing or Flashdance draped intimacy in music, sweat, and dramatic lighting. Meanwhile, VHS tapes brought cinema, and for the first time, adult films, directly into homes. What had once required sneaking into a discreet theater could now be rented from a video store, slipped quietly into a player, and rewound before return. Magazines expanded, too. Glossy covers in grocery stores featured advice columns, confessionals, and expert opinions, making intimacy not just a private matter, but a topic for mainstream reading. The language of intimacy became part of pop culture in ways it had never been before. The politics of desire, of course, the 1980s were not shy about politicizing everything. Debates raged about morality, education, and the role of government in personal lives. Religious leaders declared the epidemic as punishment for sin. Activists countered with marches, art, and demands for dignity. Intimacy was not simply an act between two people. It was now a battlefield of culture wars. And yet, in living rooms and bedrooms, life went on. Couples experimented. Singles navigated dating in an era of fear. The contradictions were everywhere. Glossy advertisements promised desire without consequence, while nightly news warned of consequence without mercy. The 1990s, a digital awakening as the 1980s faded. The 1990s entered with a different energy, still loud but more technological. The internet was slowly arriving, awkward and dial-up, but brimming with possibility. For intimacy, it was a quiet revolution. Early chat rooms allowed people to connect anonymously. What had once been confined to bars or personal ads now expanded into cyberspace. People who felt isolated, by geography, by identity, or by taboo, could find entire communities online. It was liberating, though not without risks. Anonymity encouraged honesty, but also deception. What you typed might be true, or it might not be. Meanwhile, dating itself began to shift. The idea of meeting someone through a screen was strange at first, but curiosity won out. What started as clunky websites would, in time, become entire industries. The seeds were planted here in the awkward HTML and dial-up buzz of the 90s. Television and normalizing the conversation, mainstream entertainment, too, continued to reshape intimacy. Sitcoms like Friends joked openly about dating, sex, and awkward relationships. Shows like Sex and the City, arriving at the end of the decade, brought intimacy into prime-time discussion with a frankness that earlier generations would have blushed at. Movies pushed further as well, exploring desire not just as fantasy, but as comedy, tragedy, or drama. Hollywood no longer simply hinted, it declared. The line between art and provocation blurred, often deliberately. Celebrity culture and tabloid intrusion. The 1990s also gave rise to tabloid obsession. Paparazzi followed celebrities relentlessly, and their private relationships became public fodder. Affairs, divorces, and scandals splashed across headlines. What had once been hidden was now dissected, often cruelly, for entertainment. This shaped how ordinary people thought about their own relationships, for better or worse. Technology at home. The internet wasn't the only technological change. VHS gave way to DVDs, making access to media even easier. Adult industries adapted quickly, distributing content globally. The once taboo world of intimate imagery became only a click or a rental away. This democratization of access raised new questions. How did fantasy shape expectation? How did media influence real relationships? These were questions that the culture was only beginning to wrestle with. Toward the millennium, by the late 1990s, intimacy was firmly intertwined with technology, media, and politics. The seeds of our modern digital world were already sprouting, though few realized how quickly they would grow. Mobile phones were arriving. The internet was accelerating. Social media was just around the corner. The story of intimacy was about to move into an entirely new phase, fast, global, and endlessly connected. But before we get there, the 1980s and 1990s remind us that even in decades filled with sequins, neon, and dial-up tones, intimacy was never just about desire. It was about fear, resilience, and adaptation. Swipe, click, connect. The 2000s and early digital intimacy. Hey everyone! Tonight we're wandering into the 2000s, a decade that promised sleek technology, glowing screens, and a future that felt just around the corner. For intimacy, it was both exciting and overwhelming. Suddenly, conversations that once happened in whispered phone calls or over coffee could be replaced with texts, emails, or a profile picture on a screen. So, dim the lights, and let's drift slowly through the early years of the digital age, where desire met dial-up. And then, broadband, texting, the new love letter at. The turn of the millennium, mobile phones went from being clunky status symbols to everyday essentials. With them came a simple but revolutionary tool, text messaging. Texts changed everything. No longer did you have to risk a nervous phone call or wait for days to send a letter. Instead, you could type a few words, sprinkle in some cryptic abbreviations, "You up?" being the timeless classic, and send them instantly. Intimacy became shorter, faster, and more frequent. Of course, not everyone adapted gracefully. Parents struggled to understand why teenagers spent hours hunched over small, glowing screens. Employers grumbled about distracted workers. And somewhere, inevitably, someone had to explain to a judge what exactly a text chain meant in a divorce case. Online dating arrives. The late 1990s had experimented with online dating, but the 2000s brought it mainstream. Sites like Match.com, eHarmony, and OkCupid offered not just a list of singles, but the illusion of science. Algorithms promised to pair you with the one based on compatibility scores, psychological surveys, and, let's be honest, how flattering your photo looked. For many, this was liberating. No longer were people limited to their social circle or their local bar. A world of possibility sat behind a login screen. For others, it felt cold, mechanical. Love reduced to drop-down menus and profile blurbs. Still, millions signed up. Some found lifelong partners. Others collected horror stories of awkward first dates and misleading profile pictures. Online dating became both a punchline and a lifeline, reshaping how people thought about courtship. Social media and oversharing. If online dating offered structure, social media offered chaos. Platforms like MySpace and later Facebook turned personal lives into public broadcasts. Suddenly, relationships weren't just private matters. They were statuses. Everyone knew who was single, who was in a relationship, and, for the truly unlucky, who was, "It's complicated." This visibility changed intimacy. Breakups that might once have been discreet now played out in friend feeds. New couples posed for carefully curated photos, tagged locations, and received public commentary on their private lives. Privacy became optional, even unfashionable, and naturally oversharing flourished. Posts, photos, and late-night messages blurred the line between private affection and public performance. A kiss wasn't just a kiss anymore, it was content. The rise of digital desire, as internet speeds increased, so too did access to content. What had once trickled in through magazines or VHS tapes now flooded in through websites. Entire industries were reshaped by the speed, reach, and anonymity of the digital age. Fantasy became more accessible than ever, but it also raised new questions. How did this constant stream of imagery affect expectations? How did it influence real relationships? Scholars, parents, and bewildered journalists all weighed in, usually with more panic than clarity. Sexting and scandals, if texting was the new love letter, sexting was its unruly cousin. By the mid-2000s, camera phones allowed for images, not just words, to travel instantly. This, predictably, led to a wave of regrettable decisions, many of which made headlines. Politicians, celebrities, and ordinary people alike discovered that digital intimacy had one fatal flaw: permanence. What was sent in confidence could be forwarded, leaked, or screenshotted. For some, it was harmless flirtation. For others, it became scandal, humiliation, or even legal trouble. It was a reminder that technology always gives, and technology always takes away. Everyday relationships in a connected world beyond scandals and headlines. The early 2000s reshaped ordinary relationships. Couples texted throughout the day, staying constantly in touch. Long-distance partners used webcams and early video calls, turning separation into something more bearable. At the same time, the very presence of constant connection created pressure. If someone didn't reply to a text right away, was it neglect? If they posted online but didn't message you, was it a sign? Intimacy had never been so connected or so carefully monitored. Toward the age of apps, by the end of the 2000s, smartphones had arrived. The iPhone, launched in 2007, turned the internet into something you carried in your pocket. Apps soon followed, promising easier ways to connect, meet, and match. It was here, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, that intimacy fully entered the digital age. Tinder, Grindr, and their many descendants turned dating into swipes and taps, casual encounters into instant logistics. For some, it was liberating. Love, lust, and companionship all streamlined by an app. For others, it was overwhelming. A reminder that efficiency doesn't always equal satisfaction. Closing thoughts on the digital dawn. The 2000s and early 2010s left intimacy transformed. What had once been letters and long conversations became texts, profiles, and swipes. Desire became both more accessible and more fragile, shaped by technology's speed and permanence. As we drift into the 2010s and beyond, intimacy will become even more entangled with screens, filtered, curated, and global. But here at the dawn of apps and smartphones, we can see the moment when love, desire, and technology truly merged. What was S3X really like in ancient Egypt? And more, hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a world of linen, incense, and far too much sand. A world where gods walked in animal heads, where kings were worshipped like sun-born divinities, and where even the most mundane human activities, eating, washing, marrying, and yes, mating, were observed under the watchful eye of the divine. So, settle in. Dim the lights, let your phone rest on the pillow beside you, and get comfortable. Because tonight, we're going to wander through the strange, slightly awkward, and surprisingly human history of intimacy in ancient Egypt, along with a few other royal oddities that spin out from it. Don't worry, this won't be a scandalized modern exposé or a breathless soap opera. Think of it more as a quiet stroll through dusty papyri, faded wall paintings, and the very peculiar personal habits of the pharaohs. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that powerful people rarely manage to behave like sensible ones. Now, when it comes to ancient Egypt, the first thing to remember is people were still people. Despite the pyramids, the mummies, and the divine titles, they had the same awkward, complicated desires as anyone else. The difference is that their entire worldview wrapped even the simplest things, like marriage or childbirth, in heavy layers of cosmic symbolism. For example, to the Egyptians, sexuality wasn't simply physical, it was divine. Creation itself, they believed, had sprung from a sort of cosmic act of self-love performed by the first god, Atom. He, rather proudly, produced the first generation of gods from his own body, a myth that, I imagine, must have been rather uncomfortable to explain to children. And from there, nearly every royal act of intimacy was loaded with cosmic meaning. The Nile flooding each year wasn't just a nice bit of irrigation. It was the land itself being fertilized, which meant, naturally, that the king and queen had to mirror these cycles in their own rituals. Symbolism piled upon symbolism until the royal bedchamber was essentially a theological battlefield. Let's drift to one of the more awkward traditions, fertility festivals. There's evidence that during certain ceremonies, the pharaoh was expected to publicly display his virility, sometimes even in ways that sound like they belonged in a far less family-friendly genre of performance. The reasoning was simple. If the pharaoh was potent, the land would be too. The crops depended, in a way, on his stamina. Imagine your entire country judging the year's harvest by your personal abilities. No pressure at all. The everyday Egyptians, of course, lived with less ceremonial weight. Marriage was a straightforward affair. There were no lavish legal ceremonies, no priests, no temples required. If a man and woman moved in together, shared a home, and called each other husband and wife, that was enough. A practical arrangement? Romantic, perhaps not, but functional divorce was also simple. If things didn't work out, either partner could walk away. Women, remarkably, had more legal independence in Egypt than in many later civilizations. They could own property, sue in court, and leave unhappy marriages. Not exactly a feminist paradise, but certainly a more flexible society than, say, medieval Europe, where a woman was essentially the property of whichever grumpy man happened to claim her. Now, you might be wondering what intimacy itself was like. Here the historical record becomes creative. The Egyptians, like the Greeks and Romans after them, had their share of risque graffiti. Some of the surviving fragments are, frankly, what we'd call not safe for work. Except they were carved onto public walls, so technically, safe for everyone's morning commute. One particularly famous papyrus, known as the Turin erotic papyrus, is filled with illustrations that leave little to the imagination. Scholars have debated whether it was meant as satire, as bawdy entertainment, or perhaps even instructional material. Personally, I like to think it was just someone's ancient sketchbook that wasn't meant to survive 3,000 years, because that is exactly the kind of bad luck history has. Pharaohs, of course, treated intimacy less like a private matter and more like a dynastic chess move. The royal household was a maze of siblings, half-siblings, cousins, and political wives, all strategically arranged to maintain the purity of the bloodline, which in practice usually meant the bloodline was getting progressively thinner, weaker, and more accident-prone. Take Ptolemy II, for instance. He married his full sister Arsinoe. The Greeks, who had their own share of odd habits, were still somewhat scandalized by this. But in Egypt, the royal family was supposed to mirror the gods, many of whom had no qualms about sibling marriages. By keeping it in the family, pharaohs claimed to maintain their divine essence. What they actually maintained was a long tradition of genetic headaches. And then, of course, there's Cleopatra VII, famous for her beauty, though in truth, most coins suggest she looked more like someone permanently suspicious of everyone around her. Cleopatra had relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, both legendary in their own right, though neither partnership ended particularly well. One was assassinated, the other died in a disastrous war, and Cleopatra herself took the dramatic way out. But in between, these liaisons weren't just personal, they were statecraft. Pillows and politics tangled into one. Daily life, for ordinary Egyptians, was more practical. Contraception, for example, was attempted with an array of substances that range from mildly unpleasant to truly terrible ideas. Crocodile dung mixed with honey was one recipe. I'll let you imagine the logistics. Other mixtures included acacia gum, dates, and fiber plugs. Were they effective? Possibly. At least effective enough to keep the tradition alive for centuries. Pregnancy and childbirth, meanwhile, were seen as highly spiritual events. Amulets, incantations, and protective statues were common. Gods like Taweret, the hippo-shaped goddess of fertility, were called upon to watch over mothers. The irony is that despite all the charms and prayers, childbirth remained as dangerous as ever. Medicine was limited, infections were common, and infant mortality was high. But the Egyptians, ever practical, simply folded this into their world view. Life was fragile and the gods mysterious. Now, we can't talk about Egyptian intimacy without mentioning one of the strangest royal practices, ceremonial role play. Some texts suggest that, at least on occasion, the pharaoh was expected to perform rituals symbolically reenacting the union of gods. In some versions, his queen joined him. In others, he played both parts alone. The records are vague, perhaps mercifully so, but it paints a picture of kingship as one long, exhausting theater production, with divine approval hanging on your willingness to improvise. And then there's the issue of the afterlife. Egyptians didn't believe desire ended with death. Tombs contained erotic imagery, and some texts suggested couples would continue their relationships beyond the grave. Mummification itself, with its focus on preserving every part of the body, had a kind of intimacy to it, though one suspects not the kind most people would volunteer for. Let's drift for a moment into the wider world of royal oddities. Because Egypt wasn't the only place where rulers tangled themselves in strange dynastic webs. The habit of marrying within the family would later pop up in medieval and early modern Europe, with consequences ranging from the mildly absurd to the downright tragic. But Egypt set the early model. Kings and queens elevated above ordinary morality, bound by rituals that made their most private moments a matter of state interest. It's a reminder that power doesn't just corrupt, it complicates. It takes the simple act of two people sharing a life and turns it into a myth, a ritual, or a symbol heavy enough to crush the humans underneath. So what was sex really like in ancient Egypt? Well, awkward, symbolic, occasionally practical, and often bizarre. Just like everywhere else in history. The difference is that the Egyptians left us enough papyri, graffiti, and temple carvings to remind us that they weren't so different from us after all. They loved, they argued, they experimented, and they complained. The only real difference is that their bedtime stories happen to involve crocodile dung. Let's drift gently onward now, leaving the hot sands of the Nile behind. Our next stop will carry us forward in time across the Mediterranean into the gilded palaces and grim nursery rooms of European royalty, where intimacy once again became less about love and more about dynasties. Because if you thought sibling marriage in Egypt was peculiar, just wait until we wander into the Habsburgs.